My dear brothers and sisters, when the issue of slavery, some issues related to slavery immediately come to mind, we witness that most people hate that institution, that thing called slavery. Especially in a time like the XXth century, when so-called false freedoms, virtual freedoms are so much talked about. Is there slavery left? As if there is slavery in this world? But there is not. Even though we are in the 21st century, even though we live in a modern world, even though when we read history, when we read about slaves, slavery, slave markets, slave traders in history, we get angry in a different way. Believe me, if we take a good look at the life we are living now, we will witness that slavery is in our lives as much as it used to be, even more severely than before, and that many people, even people who think they are free, live like slaves. Therefore, this issue of slavery is not only a historical issue, it is also an issue that needs to be taken very seriously in today's world. Yes, maybe it is not as it was in history, but there are some things that were practiced in history. I mean, even though we live in the 21st century, we know, read, and even witness the existence of slavery in different parts of the world, like the slavery in history. But there are some slaveries where slaves who think they are free are actually more in those areas. For example, when we make an assessment today, taking into account today's conditions, we see a lot of people who are slaves to their desires. We come across people who are slaves to their ambition, to their greed, to their envy, to their whim, to their ambition in many areas. A lot of people who are slaves to their fears, fear of losing, fear of being condemned, fear of not winning, fear of not winning, fear of not being liked, fear of people not liking me, fear of people not liking me, and fear of the future. Let's talk about a very serious area of slavery. Those who are slaves to the digital and virtual world. There are so many of them, and they are so enslaved that many of us are not even aware of it. When we stand in front of our computers, when we stand in front of our tablets, or when we pick up our phones, we think that we are using them. But unfortunately, we don't realize that we are being used because we cannot use them in a Muslim way. We don't realize that we are digital slaves. For example, there are so many people who are slaves to brands and fashions, and these are the slaves at this point. For example, there is brand obsession. Ladies and gentlemen don't matter. They are obsessed with fashion, for example. Whether it should be like this or like that, these are the steps taken to live lives within the framework of those impositions imposed by capitalism. What's going on? Those who are slaves to pleasure and lust, you know what bitter examples there are in this field. Believe me, we can talk for hours about how women in particular are enslaved at this point, how they are actually condemned to a modern slavery, concubinage. There are so many people who are slaves to the disease of consumption and spending, those diseases of consumption that are imposed, that disease of spending more at work, and the debt bondage that this brings. Today, let's say for this country, look at the people around you, for God's sake. Maybe there are some of my brothers and sisters listening to me who doesn't have debts. Everyone has installments that they are responsible for paying, that they have to pay. Those salaries that end before the salary even arrives. A lot of new borrowings before the month ends. A lot of troubles at this point. Yes, we all know that we are seriously affected by the current cost and inflation at this point, but there is also this area that affects this borrowing, especially at the point of consuming and spending, and what we say to each other in the name of bondage, whether consciously or unconsciously, and those areas where this enslaves us in a way. Those who are slaves to the disease of multiplication and accumulation. Let's multiply, multiply, multiply more, accumulate more. We saved for our children. Let's save for their grandchildren. Let's accumulate, accumulate. And because of that accumulation, other problems arise. For example, let's say, with us, if there are employees, to be a part of this established system, with or without realizing that we are actually enslaving our workers and employees by entering into their rights because of that passion to accumulate and multiply. As the ummah of a prophet who said, "Give the sweat of your brow its due before it dries," we lead a life without paying attention to the sweat of anyone's brow. When we observe a process in which respect for labor remains only in speeches at work, and when we observe well what kind of bondage, what kind of slavery the really working people are condemned to, we see what is happening in this field. Those who are slaves to belonging, for example, this is such a thing that most of the time we are not even aware of it. The man is a slave to his family, he doesn't realize it. For example, he has joined a congregation. Why do people join a congregation? To be a good person, to be a moral person, to benefit from the blessings of that community. But he doesn't realize that he has become a slave of the community. He doesn't realize that he has become a slave of the foundation, the association. Allah has blessed him to be from a race. Which race? Turkish, Kurdish, Arab, English, French. It doesn't matter. He blesses his own race. He is a slave to his race, a slave to his geography, a slave to his gender. For example, he doesn't realize that if he is a man, he is a slave to his masculinity. If he is a woman, he is a slave to her femininity. In other words, there are so many people who are slaves of their belongings on the ground at the time we are living now. Look, there are so many people who are slaves to power, property, the majority, the masses, and the state. He bows down to whoever is in power. Let me be on good terms with him. Let me not fall out with him. Let him be in my network. I will have something to do with him in the future. This will happen. That will happen. Those who calculate by thinking ahead are actually slaves of power, slaves of property, slaves of wealth, the majority. I obey the crowd, whatever the masses say. At most, whatever the public opinion is, wherever the public opinion is, wherever the tendencies of the public opinion are, right, I am there. I follow the majority and say, it is not the truth, it is the majority. The state says something, is it true or not? To be a slave of the state with a prejudice, like if it is the state, it is true without researching it. We are citizens. We are not slaves of the state. But when you start to see the state elsewhere, you become a slave. You don't realize that by blessing it, in fact, by carrying it to the point of blessing it, you turn the position you should stand there upside down, and you become a slave. And the last one, my beautiful brothers and sisters, are those who are slaves to their beliefs and values. Is a man a slave to his religion? Yes. Religion is a system that has come to liberate man, especially Islam, especially Allah's beloved system. But when that religion is distorted, when that religion is made a tool in the hands of some people for their own interests, they unknowingly become slaves of that religion by preserving only the form of that religion and killing its spirit. To be a slave of that religion instead of being a servant of Allah, or to be a slave of some things in this sense as imposed by the people who distorted that religion. Therefore, what we call slavery, this is not a matter of history. Many more things can be said. Now, in the face of all this, we need to hear the Quranic cry, Fekurakabe. The divine word says freedom for slaves. It is shouting. It is a cry, and it says freedom for slaves in a verse that was revealed in the first days of Mecca. Free personalities voiced that cry of freedom for slaves. It makes no sense for people who are slaves themselves to say Fekurakabe. First of all, a person's liberation with the Quran, Islam, being a servant to Allah, and his liberation from all the shackles, chains, and dungeons that surround him, whatever shackles are on his feet, neck, and wrists that prevent him from working and enslave him, we are asked to understand the full meaning of servitude to Allah, to remember one's responsibilities to fulfill the requirements of that servitude, to remember the fact that Tawheed is the greatest freedom, to enjoy that freedom, and then to present it to the thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of enslaved people around him by saying that freedom is such a sweet thing. If we understand this and fulfill the necessity of it, by God, we will become free and liberated. If we don't, we will live as slaves. We will think we are free. We will think that we are not under any yoke, but we will never see that we are under dozens of yokes. We will come as slaves and go as slaves. May Allah protect us from this and bring us to that beautiful flavor called freedom as soon as possible.